Okay, this is Richard Monette from Active for Life. I'm sitting here in Calgary with John O'Sullivan. He's the leader of the Changing the Game project. So welcome.
Thank you,
John.
Richard. It's great to be here.
So tell me a bit about your background.
Well, I was a multi-sport kid growing up. I grew up in New York. One of those kids who just, played whatever was in season. And I often tell, I played soccer. I played pond hockey. I never played an organized hockey game in my life, but I played for years skating on a pond in the winter and played 1 year of organized basketball. But all summer I'd play 3-on-3 with friends, and I wrestled. I played baseball, played golf, and then I really fell in love with the soccer piece, and so I played collegiately, played professionally for a short while, and then really got into coaching and fell in love with coaching. And I think I've been very lucky with my coaching education. I worked with all levels, from 6-year-olds to 26-year-olds, on the men's side, on the women's side, and learned all the different ages and stages, and working with those kids. And then a couple of years ago, I got out of coaching because I felt like I would like to contribute in a bigger way from what I had learned as an athlete and a coach. And that led to the founding of the Changing the Game project, to the writing of a couple books. And now myself and my team, we travel around the world and we talk to coaches, we talk to parents, we work with athletes, and just trying to make a more player-first or player-centered environment in sports, and teach all the people involved how we can do that, so we can combat the massive dropout rates and the burnout rates in sports. Because as your organization knows very well, a lot of kids who are burnt out and walk away, they don't come back.
Yeah.
Ever.
Ever.
So all the health consequences that last their whole life because of a bad early sporting experience. So that's what we do now.
That's really interesting. Our backgrounds are similar because I'm the lead of the Active for Life initiative, and Active for Life came to be for pretty much the same reason. So this is something I see now around the world. There are these emerging movements or emerging organizations, and some have been around for a while, but there's more and more people and more organizations that actually understand the importance, one, of sport, two, of moving. I mean, to quote the organization in the States, we are designed to move. Mm-hmm. People are designed to move. If we don't move, things go wrong. Mm-hmm. And we're pretty much on the same page. And what we're trying to do at Active for Life is give a tool to parents, give the tools and resources so they can actually help their kids develop physical literacy, because physically literate kids are more likely to be active, and active kids are healthy or healthier. Usually they do better at school and they do better socially. Mm-hmm. And a big part of what we do is really trying to promote a better experience in sport. For us in Canada, it's the LTAD approach that is age appropriate and really based on science and best practices. Mm-hmm. So we're really connected that way. Mm-hmm. So this conversation, I think, could go on for days. You're talking to all these coaches, all these parents, all these organizations, and how do you create change, or what is your approach to try to change the way they do things? Because we're talking about changing ways of being, changing the game.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest challenges is when things have become, let's call them common sense or standard practice. Those are the things that are the hardest to change, right? They talk about in athletic training, that this idea of rest, ice, compression, elevation, that became like the standard thing. But now they're saying, oh, maybe that's not the best thing for injuries and things, and how hard that is to change this common sense. And so I think when we're talking about sports, it's the same thing, that the way that we do things has become so ingrained in people that they don't stop and say, well, wait, should I be doing it this way? And so the parents get caught up with the Joneses, and they look at, oh, well, the hockey player down the street is doing this extra summer skate, so my kid will fall behind if he doesn't. Or, the soccer kid is doing these extra trainings, so my daughter's going to fall behind if she doesn't. And we don't stop to say, well, wait a sec, is that a good thing? And based on their age and their development, what is, what's really good for them? And I think from a coaching standpoint, it's the same thing. Most people coach like they were coached, and so they do something that was maybe appropriate or acceptable 30 years ago, and they're not open to these new ideas. They're not open to saying, well, wait, maybe there's a better way. And so I think any organization that's trying to make change, and I agree with you, there's a lot of them popping up. And I think it's, that I've connected with you, and I've connected with Sport for Life and the Positive Coaching Alliance in the United States and Proactive Coaching. So I think a lot of these organizations are starting to make inroads with each other, because I don't think that people can hear this message too much.
Yeah.
If they start saying, I'm sick and tired of hearing about physical literacy, that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing.
That's a good thing, yeah.
And so I think when we're trying to make changes on this big a scale, those of us involved in the movements really have to realize that, those changes are probably not going to happen in our lifetime, or maybe not affect our own kids, but we're still willing to do it. And we don't care who gets the credit, as long as these changes happen.
That's really interesting. I was on a phone meeting this morning where someone said alluded to what you're talking about, which is, oh, well, all these organizations are coming out and promoting this better approach, but aren't you afraid of confusing people? I said, well, not really. It's actually good to have many touch points with parents and coaches. If they get the same information from 5 different sources, it's likely more believable. Using a sport analogy, what happened this morning, I was talking to, my response to this person was, well, if there's 5 coaches in a certain span of time that are teaching a kid to hit a ball in baseball, if they all come back to the same sound fundamentals,
Right.
the kid will learn how to hit the ball. And that's the way I see the sector, the movement right now. There's a lot of people talking about the same fundamental ideas, and that's what matters.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of love songs out there, I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
they're all about, they're all love songs, and some speak to some people and some speak to others. And I think as long as we get back to the same philosophy of, and I mean, again, I think certainly in the United States, there's other organizations that do the kind of workshops in coaching development and parent workshops and athlete development that we do. And I say, man, great, bring them in. If we're not a good fit, bring them in, because I know we're talking about the same things. And I can come in and speak, and I'll reach certain people, and then they can come in and say the same exact thing in a different way, and they'll reach certain people that I didn't. So the more of us talking about this, the better. It's not worse at all.
Awesome. When you say you talked, what do you find is particularly effective in creating this moment in parents and coaches? Is there anything that you've seen that actually works more often than not? Some ideas, some thoughts, some processes, or whatever?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges, and I don't know that anyone is quite solved this one yet, is that the vast majority of parents, well, first of all, I say the vast majority of parents, let's just stick on that subject, they're great people, right? They're good. They love their kids. They don't always love them in helpful ways, but their intentions are excellent. So they come with this thing as, well, my intentions are great. And so, yeah, there's lots of problems with sports with those other people over there. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we're always trying to overcome is how do we, so people come to our talks and they come up to me after and they say, wow, I wasn't going to come because I didn't think this applied to me, but wow, there's a lot of stuff I hadn't really thought about before. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the most important things we can do, or what I've found to be very effective, and our presentations are a mix of stories and videos and things, but what really seems to resonate is when you come around to this idea of, if it's not appropriate here, why is it appropriate here? That sort of gives parents. Yeah, sure. So I'll show us something in my talks where I'll show a video of my daughter when she was 7 years old at her first piano recital, and it's 30 seconds, and she makes a couple of mistakes, and then it stops, and I say, now, raise your hand if you thought her piano teacher was going to start screaming at her, right? You know, and
Yes,
everyone
yeah.
laughs, right? And they're like, of course not, right? Or that the parents are going to start yelling out, you know, you're ruining the recital, right? Of course not. And then I show a video of a 7-year-old soccer game, and everyone's yelling instructions and, you know, telling people what to do and where to go and where to kick it and when to kick it and all these things. I'm saying, why do we think it's okay here when we know it's not okay here? And then we know it's not, wouldn't be helpful in the math test to yell at the kids to carry the one, right? Well, why do we think it's okay in sports? Why wouldn't we grasp this concept that it's just as distracting?
So it's the context.
I think it's the context of that hits. You know, I mean, again, I show a video clip from a great HBO series called Trophy Kids.
Yeah.
Of a kid sitting in the back seat of his car on the ride home with his dad giving him the 10th degree. And it's amazing how many people I'll look out and I'll see like people wiping away tears because that moment, seeing that kid and listening to that dad is their moment when they said, oh my God, that's me.
Yeah.
And all I was doing was trying to help,
Yeah.
right? I'm trying to help my kid. I'm telling him or her, hey, if you did this different, right? Or you did this wrong or whatever. And I never realized before what was happening behind me was maybe I was making my kids hate sports.
Yeah.
And so to try to give as many of those aha moments as possible for people, I think is really important because each one is going to resonate with someone differently. And even if every parent went home and did one thing different, whether it was have that conversation with their kid about what would you like me to say on the sideline of the game, or would you rather not talk about the game on the way home? I mean, that can change a kid's life.
It's really interesting what you say. At Active for Life, we call these parents the quiet majority.
Yeah.
So the great majority of parents want to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you explain the common sense, like for your example, that's common sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't scream at a kid in recital while you're screaming at your kid at a soccer game. That's common sense. Most parents understand that. And then there's what we call the very loud minority or the very vocal minority. And sometimes, you know, if the parents who are in the quiet majority just say something to those who are too loud or too obnoxious, it changes the game.
Yeah, very much so. And it creates, and this is the thing, you know, as a coach, your job when you're there is to coach the players, not to monitor the sideline behavior at the same time. And so this is the challenge. We have to create this culture of accountability amongst parents. And it starts with the educational piece and the engagement piece where we say to parents, you have to teach them what's appropriate, what the standards are. And then when I'm losing it on the sideline and you come up to me and you say, hey, John, you know, remember we talked about not doing this. Now it's a reminder, right? But if you come up to me out of the blue and say something, and I'm like, who are you to tell me what to do? And so this is our challenge is it has to start with getting the information out there. And then we have to empower parents to hold each other accountable. And I've worked with organizations that are really doing a great job of this. But understanding that, and they do a great job because A, they're not perfect and they're okay with that. And B, they realize that creating that culture, it's not an event. It's not a John O'Sullivan talk. It's a process, right? And so we have to, we have to constantly do it. We have to constantly keep reinforcing the message and bringing it up. And again, if in the business world, when they talk about core values of an organization, they say, if my people say they're sick of hearing this message, I know I'm doing a good job.
So how are people reacting? How are they, like we're talking about minor sports coaches and parents, how are they reacting to your message? And what change is happening after they listen to you or they read up different articles and so on? What change are you seeing out there?
Well, I would say that it varies from organization to organization, right? Some organizations say, okay, we're going to bring in a speaker from the Change the Game project, and we're going to mandate that everyone shows up. And now you're going to get the span from, let's call them the perfect parents to the problem parents. Then other organizations just say, hey, we recommend you show up. And then mostly that room would be filled with people who already kind of get this, right? And so then it's teaching them, how do we create a movement around this, and how do we spread this? And what we teach is, if I tell you, can you think of a person who really needs to hear this? You're thinking of the outlier who's waiting for the referee in the parking lot, but he's probably not going to listen.
Yeah.
But this quiet majority that you speak of, they will listen. So teach them so that we can change the culture so that this outlier it's no longer a comfortable place to be, right? And you either come over, you stop attending, or you leave. But either way, problem solved for our team. And I think that's how change has to happen, one family at a time, one team at a time. It's impossible for Hockey Canada to mandate that change, or even Hockey Calgary, or to mandate that change. I mean, you can't. It's really got to be a bottom-up thing.
Yeah, so John is referring to Hockey Canada because Hockey Canada was generous enough to lend us a room so we can have this chat. So what you're saying is that we need all to create this critical mass of people who will change the norms around the game.
And think about big movements that's happened. Smoking, right? We've now created a critical mass of people who don't smoke and realize all the problems with smoking, and so now you can't smoke in public buildings, and you can't even smoke in public parks in the United States, and so we've changed that. Whereas in Europe, they haven't necessarily done that, right? So there's a lot more smoking, and there's a lot more of that. And I think any type of movement, whether it's an environmental movement, whether it's civil rights, whether it's they all take time to create this critical mass. And so that's why I think it's great that there's tons of organizations out there, each doing their piece to create this critical mass.
I'm totally.
And because let's face it, that the kid growing up today, whose parents are doing things the right way and focusing on physical literacy and multi-sport and keeping sports a positive experience, those kids are probably going to do the same thing for their kids.
Yeah, it's a never-ending cycle, basically.
It's the cycle, yeah.
If we go with what you said earlier, if a lot of coaches coach based on the way they were coached, if we improve the way we coach now, the future is brighter.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
John, I got one last question. You've been doing this for a while now, a couple of years. How long has the Changing the Game project?
Sort of 2012, I decided to write the book. Came out in December of 2013, so kind of that summer is when I started doing a little bit of speaking and traveling and started a blog and everything like that.
So in that span of time, what's the most important thing you've learned?
Patience.
Lots of it.
Humility. I go around and, any talk I do, I'm just like, pretty much everything I'm talking about that I suggest you do is something that I've screwed up. So I say, for many years I coached before I had my own kids, so I got to mess up everyone else's kids before I had my own. But I would say really one of the biggest things that I try to get across to coaches especially, but also parents, and anyone who's a parent knows this, is that every person is different, right? And so there's a guy named Dr. Martin Toms, I think, from Sweden, and he says, you don't coach a sport, you coach a child, right? And I think this is the most important thing that we can always realize, is that I'm not coaching soccer, I'm coaching Johnny, and I'm coaching Bill, and I'm coaching Tommy, and they all need something different from me. And the more that I can connect with them and recognize what each of those individuals need within the context of a team, the more successful I will be at helping them achieve their potential, and the more successful that group will be as well, because you'll have the most kids, achieving at a high level. And so I think as a young coach, I very much, I coach the sport,
Yeah.
and try to cram everyone into my narrow view of it. And now I'm a very different coach, and I'd like to think that I am able to reach more people and have a more greater understanding for the powerful impact that I can have in their life just through my words. And so everything I say has to be so intentional. And so, because I can't pick and choose what they're going to remember.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Coach, a kid might play a sport until they're 18 or 20, whatever, and then when they're 60, they
Yeah.
look back. They rarely remember how many games they've lost or won, but they do remember those discussions, that communication with the coaches.
Yeah,
So-
I had one of my aha moments as a coach. I was about 28, 29 years old, and a couple years into my coaching career, and got a call from a former player years later who was studying to go to med school. And he said, I'm calling to say thanks, because as I'm studying to go to med school, every time I want to put my books down, I think of you, saying, can you do it one more time? Can you do it a little bit better? Is that the best you can do today? And he said, so I picked my books up because of you. And I was thinking, and I told my colleague at the time, I got off the phone, I told him this, and he said, wow, that's great. I'm like, that's not great. I'm like, that's the worst story I've ever heard. Because when I coached that kid, there was like all these other kids that I was like, you should just take up kayaking instead or something like that. So, so that was a huge aha moment for me when I started to really realize the impact and thought about coaching being not coaching but teaching and mentoring and I think when you get invited to your first wedding, your first graduation, these major life events of your athletes, that they think back and say, this guy coached me 10 years ago, but in one of my most important life events, I want him or her to be a part of it. That's when you start realizing the true impact that you can have.
Very wise words. Well, John, on behalf of Active for Life, thank you very much for this discussion. It was fascinating, and congratulations for your good work, and keep it up.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.